I guess we'll go ahead and have a little bit of a formal start, but really just to kind of not get in the way of the momentum that was already starting as we have other people joining. My part will be small in this, but
Mhm.
I have the honor of introducing our guests in just a moment. But I just wanted to start by introducing RIF to everybody who's joined us tonight. Some of you have participated in RIF events before. Um, I hope that we're also bringing some new people into the White River Indie film community. We are really just an extraordinary little group of film lovers, filmmakers, and I think we're so fortunate at this intersection here in the Upper Valley with all of the fascinating artists and scholars and audiences who come through here and connect through a shared love of film. And we were so thrilled this year in our selection process, which is unusual compared to some other festivals, in that we don't have an open submission. We have a group of, it ranges from 15 to 20 people every year who are just volunteers who want to sign up to watch a whole lot of movies. And then through our networks, we reach out to festivals or to independent filmmakers who we know have works in progress, and we just try by having a diverse sampling of people from our community to find films that we think will resonate and that are bringing something unique to our community that they might not find in the crowded streaming universe, or which might not be available. As much as there is out there, there's still a lot that's hard to find, and so we try to find films that we think really matter, and where we also feel that it matters that these filmmakers be noticed. And these two films are particularly exciting to me because they are debut feature films. And I think that's a really important moment in the trajectory of a filmmaker's life, to cross that threshold. And it always happens in a very specific context. And these two films have very different contexts to how they came about, which I'm excited to explore. But we invited our guests tonight to help us um, understand more deeply that context, and part of that is cultural in the vast diversity of Africa. These two films were made nearly 3,000 miles apart from each other in very, very different cultural contexts. We're also interested in looking at the economics of how films get made and film industries, and I think we're very, very fortunate to have the perspectives of scholars, filmmakers, and a recent Dartmouth graduate who's joined us. So let me just make a quick introduction, but I'm hoping we might actually, I'm going to be fairly brief with that, but the speakers, I hope, will share anything from your very rich portfolios of work that pertain to your experience of these films, as we go. Because when I read all about you, there's so much that to share, but I'll let you kind of also pick and choose. So I'd like to start with Professor Ayo Coly, who's joining us from Dartmouth, and is a professor of comparative literature and African American studies. Her research, focuses on colonial and post-colonial discourses about Africa and gender and sexuality in African contexts. She's trained as an interdisciplinary scholar and works with literary texts, visual arts, performance arts, and historical and political material. Professor Jessie Weaver Shipley also joins us from Dartmouth, colleague in the African American Studies and Oratory at Dartmouth. Also a fellow this year at the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard. He's a writer, artist, filmmaker, ethnographer, and teacher whose work examines the links between aesthetics and power. And his scholarship focuses on music, theater, film, media technologies, urban space, labor, race, gender, and gender mobility. And he has lived in Ghana, Nigeria, South Africa, Britain, and the US, and in those different places explored how people reshape political and economic regimes through performance. And I'll just make a note there that we have a real interest in the role that film and the arts play in achieving social change. So this is a very important dimension of, I hope, will emerge in our conversation. And last but very much not least, my friend Junaid Timtuni is Yakubu, joining us from Ghana. I had the pleasure of meeting Junaid. He was not formally my student, but was very present in my classes teaching film production at Dartmouth as an actor, as always a generous crew member, just soaking up every opportunity to be on set and learn all the ins and outs of how films are made. He also appeared on camera with our friend Buki, who it looks like might have dropped off the call, but oh no, there she is. There she is, Buki. He is presently living and working in Tamale, Ghana, and I'm not sure if I pronounced that properly, Tamale.
It's all right. Yeah.
It's all right. Working primarily as an editor on a TV series called Northside TV, and had extensive experience working in videography at Dartmouth in different departments, including, interestingly, the machine shop at Thayer, which I think I read.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I am hoping this evening, I've got many questions lined up in my mind, but I wanted to explore a little bit a less top-down moderation style, because I'm really not here as a moderator, but more just to kick us off in what I hope will be a very interactive and circular conversation. And I thought it would be interesting to just have each of our guests, our three guests, share a reaction to the two films and then pose a question to your colleagues and then pass it around that way. And my suspicion is that if we just start, if you three are asking each other questions, that will generate the opportunity for others to jump in organically as the time is right. So I wondered if any of the three of you might just be, because you were already talking when I joined the call, eager to jump in with some just immediate reactions to these two films, anything you're eager to share with us about the context that you perceive in them.
Yeah, I wonder if I can start. Yes, so I watched both of the films, let's say, back to back. And watching the first one, Eyimofe, the one from Nigeria, I could relate so much to what the characters were going through, like them facing the consequences of perhaps a certain economic hardship in Lagos and trying to find salvation outside the country, And I found it to be a very, very political film, And watching the second film, which is You'll Die at 20, set in Sudan, like the setting is very different from the setting of the previous film, which is a smaller village in which this main character is burdened by this curse that his mother is very, very obsessed with and wouldn't let him escape at all, And in the end, he also finds salvation by leaving his small village to perhaps create an identity for himself. And I also found that very, very political as well. So maybe a question I would like to pose is maybe to Professor Ayo Coly, who I had taken the African political novel with. I'm just wondering what her take on it was and how that compares to some of the novels and stories we may have read in some of her classes.
Thank you so much. And I wanted also first to thank the organizers of the festival. Yeah. And it's a pleasure to see new faces, to meet new persons, and also to see people I've known, people I already know here with us. And I also wanted to congratulate you for selecting these two films, Eyimofe and You Will Die at 20. I had heard about them because of some of the acclaims they received on the international circuit, but I was yet to see them. And so like Junaid, I watched them back to back, and I had a deep appreciation for themselves, for them. And I agree also about the political nature of these two films, right? That in some ways, they are commentaries on the economic and social conditions in post-colonial Africa as a result of a number of factors, including neoliberal policies, and and they are part of that wave that post-colonial African thinkers talk about, called the literature and the arts of post-colonial disenchantment and disillusion, right? So the theme of the mood of disillusion, right, is very present throughout the two films. I mean, especially the Nigerian film, right? And the notion that Nigeria, the post-colony, both in the case of Nigeria and in the case of Sudan, are trapped, and people are trying to escape, right? Citizens basically are trying to escape. And this is where the commentary, it becomes an oblique, and actually not oblique, but a very direct commentary, right? About corruption, about malgovernance. With regard to the Nigerian film, especially, that I appreciated quite a lot. I mean, both films were depressing, right? So I really struggled to see any light at the end of the film. With regard to the Nigerian film, I really appreciated the clever deployment of the generator, right? The metaphor of the broken generator, right? And when you take a country like Nigeria, with all the capacities and the potential and the possibilities in Nigeria, right? But a country like Nigeria, and I think it's the case in Ghana also, right? And many other African nations, struggle to provide steady electric supply, right, to its population, leading those who have the means, right, or even who don't have the means, right, to fend to be able just to afford a generator, and then the generator breaks down, or because of poor, I think the problem here actually was that he had, the fuel was low grade, right? Killing his family. And he's left with that generator and always trying to fix it and to tinker it. I think this is a very important metaphor of post-colonial disenchantment and of malgovernance and population left to fend for themselves. And so my question for Jesse is that, and I can come back later and talk, because I think also it's important to place these two films in the broader context of, albeit a very problematic category, which is the category of African cinema, and how these two films are forcing us, if you want, to rethink the notion of African cinema, right? Because what is that thing that we call African cinema? What is that shared Africanness that the two films have? And Jesse, I was wondering what you made of these two films, but more specifically, Eyimofe, the Nigerian film, in light of the development in Nigeria of Nollywood, of a very distinct filmic tradition known as Nollywood. And when I was watching Eyimofe, I was thinking about the audience of Nollywood, right? Because traditionally, what is known as African cinema has failed to secure a local audience on the continent, right? Because the aesthetic, but also the cinematography of what is known as African cinema, especially cinema which is successful internationally, right, does not cater to local sensibilities. And I was wondering, Jesse, if you could help us situate Eyimofe within the tradition of Nollywood.
Sure. Thanks, Ayo. And also let me thank the moderators, the organizers, and everyone for coming and for inviting me to participate and to have a chance to watch these two films. So let me put them a little bit in the context of my understanding of Nollywood films and how Nollywood maybe comes out of a particular media tradition and performance tradition. But just really briefly, and we can come back to this in other ways. But I found them both the films to be interesting. I found them both to be cinematically really interesting, and then in some ways defying genres. And I was thinking a lot about audience, because one of the things that's happened across various types of cinema coming out of Africa, circulating through Africa, is questions about audience and questions about platform, where now how people are consuming films. For a long time, in some ways, one of the things it's important to recognize is that a lot of African media producers have been more advanced than European and American producers of music and film because they've had to experiment with technologies, with forms of consumption, in ways that people with more resources have not. But it's meant that things like Nollywood have sort of sprung up. So just very briefly, one of the things that's interesting in a place like Nigeria, and this is true in Ghana, and actually and this is sort of for Junaid, Ghana was doing sort of video films before Nigeria. So what's called Nollywood right now tends to refer to a sort of organic video film industry that really arose 1990s, 2000s with the advent of VHS, video technology, fast editing, trying to produce films for a local audience. But interestingly, this arose in Ghana earlier than it did in Nigeria in the 1980s and 90s, where some very innovative film producers were making really exciting productions. Audiences in Ghana and Nigeria, Anglophone audiences, were not really feeling a lot of what was coming out of Europe. Some things they liked, some things they didn't. And local producers were not having access to celluloid. So when video production stuff came out, they started making local stories. And they built upon really complicated theatrical traditions, everything from Soyinka to Achebe to, in Ghana, people like Mohammed Ben Abdallah, other playwrights and things like that. But they also drew on Indian cinema. They drew on a whole set of traditions, bringing them together. And at first, some of the production quality in the 80s and 90s of video films was really not good quality, especially sound. People had to sort of figure out how to make something that was viewable with very low-grade technology. So you have these incredible kind of film productions that are sort of innovating as they go. They also built upon traditions of traveling theater in Ghana and Nigeria a bit, which are called concert party, which are already variety show theater traditions. They built on these kind of proverbial storytelling traditions, but which are always already stories of modernity, stories of the nation, stories of progress. One of the things that's striking about these two thematically is I see them as political in a broad sense, in the sense that they're about stuckness. I kept thinking not so much about the infrastructural forms, but the ways in which individuals think about their relationship to the past, future, and present. And I kept watching the characters, but particularly in the Sudanese example, and the sort of sparseness of dialogue and things. The characters are sort of feeling and acting through these kinds of moments of being stuck that are profoundly political, profoundly personal, and trying to kind of come to terms with things. But that speaks to kind of the technological moment that I think was coming out of the 80s and 90s, where people were using these earlier technologies. So what's striking about the recent Nigerian ones, the recent things coming out across Africa, is the sort of incredible HD technology stuff that people are using and trying to reach new audiences. We can talk more about like what Amazon and Netflix are trying to do, what Iroko TV was trying to do in terms of Nigeria. There's all sorts of amazing things coming out. But both of these films kind of speak to the sort of complex history of trying to reach African audiences, but tell stories that are local, but then also make them also accessible outside, to have them move, and sort of the struggle. Can you make a film that's going to be accessible to multiple audiences? Not just language issues, but technology issues. Who's going to watch it where? Who's going to pay for it? Is it going to be pirated? Are you going to only have access to a Bluetooth copy on your phone, or where are you going to see it? So maybe should I throw it back to Junaid, or what? How do you want to do this?
Sure. And I just want to throw in, before you ask your question to Junaid, that Eyimofe was shot on 16 millimeter, and what you just said about video and the scarcity of celluloid makes that choice interesting. Yeah. But please go ahead and offer a question back to Junaid.
Yeah, I mean, so the question of returning to celluloid is really interesting, in like what's happening with money, because as of right now, Amazon is throwing money at trying to think about an African, both producing films in Africa and then how to reach an African audience. So the language of capital is huge right now. So Amazon is looking at Netflix and saying, wait a minute, they've reached Africa. We're behind. how many hundreds of millions do we need? Are we going to produce films in Africa? Are we going to produce things that are accessible to African audiences? Is that the same thing? If so, how do we make streaming platforms? Do we shoot on celluloid and convert it? Do we just shoot low grade? So all those questions are deeply tied up with what filmmakers can do. So that's my question for Junaid is for you as a filmmaker, and you said you're in Tamale now.
Yes.
What do you see for young filmmakers coming up? What direction, in terms of storytelling and then in terms of technological choices, what do you see the direction of cinema and or video film that you're moving towards?
Well, first of all, I'll say, first we need to think about these filmmaking traditions, right? So in Ghana, we have Gollywood, and in Nigeria, we have Nollywood, right? And I know for me and my peers here in Ghana, when we think about an African movie, it's usually the Nollywood or Gollywood tradition, of like a movie that is made at most within 2 weeks, because these film industries move really, really fast, The scripts, the scripts are probably whipped up in the process of even making the film, with like starting from a rough outline. And in terms of the access to resources to acquire the kind of equipment that you'll need to make it, it's usually bare minimum. So it's more like working with what is available and trying to make the best of it, And then when it comes to distribution, I think that's where people even have the bleakest of sort of imaginations as to where they could distribute their movies. I know when I talk to a lot of filmmakers, there's a brilliant filmmaker out here in Tamale who makes these very well thought out, detailed movies with elaborate visual effects and like mythological stories based on the histories of the ethnic groups from around here. But even when he finishes making his movies, his best opportunity is straight to DVD, So he ends up spending sometimes $20,000 on a film, but then it doesn't quite have access to the channels to distribute his films. So talking about how we see the future of filmmaking out here, I would say there's a lot of enthusiasm to tell new stories, because I think a lot of young people are emerging who want to be filmmakers, who are realizing, okay, Gollywood or like the Ghanaian film industry or even the Nigerian film industry, it's not telling stories that really reflect our reality as much as we would like them to. Or even if they are not going the whole way. So we would like to do that, But then as we think about it, and it's like, okay, we invest the most resources in making this film. Now, how do we sell it? That is where we get stuck, And of course, platforms like Netflix have emerged in the scene. And I know Netflix has established a very big presence in Nigeria. I know they've produced a number of original series, even in South Africa. Maybe they might do something in Ghana. But I understand that still, Netflix, from what I've heard from some filmmakers, Netflix does not pay enough for African films as they would pay for, say, an American film, So we're still facing that battle. But I think the distribution question is the biggest one to figure out. Yeah.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I do believe there's a lot of potential, because I would say even with watching these two films, like I remember in talking with Samantha before getting access to the links to watch these movies, I was excited about watching a movie from Sudan because I hadn't seen a movie from Sudan before. And both of these films did something to sort of expand my idea of what African cinema is. And as Professor Coly said, even with that category, what does that even mean, Because there's so much diversity on the continent. Yeah.
I mean, the other question that comes up around that I was thinking about is language and even national categories. So what makes something a quote unquote Nigerian film or Sudanese film when both of these films are questioning the kind of national categories themselves? So I was thinking there are three films, I think they're all on Netflix that it was trying to, if people haven't sort of had familiarity with Nigerian cinema, three films that are kind of trying to cross the line, walk the line between Nollywood and kind of art cinema are Green, White, Green by Abba Makama, who I brought to Dartmouth a few years ago. Daniel Arahi's film, what is it called? Oko Ashau, Taxi Driver Oko Ashau, who also came to Dartmouth. Separately, I brought him in. And then the other film, it's called October 1st or 1st October which is a really interesting film. Is it 1st October, Ayo? Which is it's the date of Nigerian independence, and a kind of murder mystery set around independence in Nigeria. And it's about, all three of those are really interesting because they're all about travel. They're all about moments of complexity around what it means to be marking national identity in a country that's itself already dealing with complex issues around post-colonial sovereignties, where different language groups, different cultures, different traditions are thrown together through colonial kind of configuration. And in the Nigerian case, the kind of particular tensions that emerge around that is really interesting. So what language do you shoot and do you subtitle? One of the choices that a lot of Nigerian cinema has tried to do to reach out, and this is true of Nigerian music too, if you listen to Nigerian pop, Afro beats, is to use Pidgin to make it accessible. So if you've listened to any music recently, you've probably heard Nigerian Afrobeats producers or rappers, even if you don't realize it, because they've sort of really gone international in the last couple of years. But one of their innovations was, and again, people were doing really interesting, deep lyrical rap music in Ghana and Nigeria from the 80s and 90s. But when Nigerian musicians started to do very simple hooks in Pidgin, it traveled because people could understand Pidgin. They could get a simple line and a hook, and it was easily recognizable and identifiable. And the same thing with sort of cinema. People are thinking, okay, if we make it Pidgin English, is that going to be more accessible? If it's in Yoruba, Ghanaians can't understand it, but if it's in Pidgin, more people, at least you can catch parts of it. Or if you mix languages, you can catch parts of it. South African television and cinema has been trying to think about that for years. You use multiple languages in the cinema to kind of think about audiences beyond or through issues of sovereignty. So there's a way in which capital and post-colonial sovereignty kind of go hand in hand in interesting kinds of ways. I don't know which directions you want us to throw it.
Well, I would love for Professor Coly, if you, I see her hand going up, would you jump in? Did I see? Oh, you're muted, Professor.
Oh, no wonder. I've been doing this for 2 years now, teaching for 2 years, and I'm still, I don't still have the automatic gestures. Anyway, so, I was thinking before maybe we open it up to a more interactive discussion with the rest of the participant people on this forum, really to think back again about the category of African cinema, right? Because there is such a thing as a category of African cinema, right? And these films usually circulate internationally and are consumed internationally as African cinema and get prizes as African cinema, right? Even on Netflix or on Amazon, you have a category of African cinema. And so I wanted to go back a little bit and talk about the origin of that category of African cinema, that originally what was understood, what constituted African cinema was cinema from Francophone Africa because of the heavy involvement. It's because of the different colonial legacies of Great Britain and France in Africa. So France heavily, in a very neo-colonialist way and paternalistic way, supported the film industry in Francophone Africa, in French-speaking Africa, focusing mostly on three countries: Senegal, Mali, and Burkina Faso. And so up to the mid-1980s, 1990s, 85% of films made in Africa came from Francophone Africa. It's really a big number, right? And so what came to be known as African cinema, and what we used to be able even to teach as African cinema and to write about as African cinema, was in fact actually Francophone African cinema. And so starting in the mid-90s with the development of Nollywood, Gollywood, and so forth, it has been a very positive development in that the category of African cinema is unraveling to the point now that what is visible and emerging is really films like Nollywood, Gollywood, and so forth. And of course, we have also South Africa, especially after apartheid, the emergence of South Africa. But also let us not forget, because there is a tendency when we talk about Africa to exclude North Africa from discussions of Africa. And so we may think about how the picture or the dynamics may change if we were to bring in North Africa, right, and the Maghreb. In some ways, I believe the Sudanese film, right, points towards North Africa. Yeah. And when thinking about also North Africa, thinking about the long filmic tradition in, in Egypt, right, that has actually among the oldest, filmic tradition in the world.
I love that, and I'm going to selfishly just take a question myself, Professor Coly, to follow up on that. You Will Die at 20, the cinema itself is very much a player. It's almost like the equivalent of the generator in Eyimofe. We return to cinema. Can you help us understand the references of the films that are, so meaningful, and also a gateway to some sense of a chapter of Sudan's history? And with that, I'll just share for the audience that Amjad Abu Alala is on a programming committee and leads up the Sudan Independent Film Festival, and which has been around for now only 6 years. It's a new festival. So there's a sense of, from what I've read about it, a sense of trying to regenerate a cinema tradition there. Can you help us connect those dots and that heritage?
So I'm not that familiar with Sudanese cinema, but I know that there has been an attempt after independence, right? Because, Sudan was a crown colony, right? So there was an attempt, right, to establish a Sudanese film unit. And I think it's maybe up until the 1980s, right, with the war on Sudan and, and the rise of Islamic and fundamentalism, right? This brought filmmaking in Sudan to a halt, right, to a halt. So it's very interesting to see, if you want, a renaissance of Sudanese cinema with a film like that. And of course, the film is gesturing. Watching it, I found the film actually is also very much, I believe, gesturing towards Egyptian cinema, right? And basically, of course, Sudan was part of Egypt, right? So it makes sense, if you want, actually, to gesture towards the tradition of Arab, Middle Eastern, Egyptian filmmaking, as opposed to Sub-Saharan Africa filmmaking.
Yeah, the other part about that's interesting is so someone like Osman Semben, who's the sort of the key figure in a certain Francophone tradition of cinema, and would hold court at FESPACO, which was the big African cinema festival in Ouagadougou, had this kind of brilliant kind of tradition of art filmmaking. A lot of the filmmakers coming out of Nigeria and Ghana were trained in some ways in documentary film through a British tradition. So there was a Gold Coast film unit in Accra, which the British set up. And Nigerian and Ghanaian filmmakers were trained there in the 50s. And it was a strange setup, because just by chance, there were a couple of sort of British civil servants who actually then just got really interested in supporting local filmmakers and did really interesting stuff. And some of these young filmmakers then became really strong proponents of independence, and they became filmmakers who then trained the next generation of Ghanaian and Nigerian cinematographers. But if you look at the kind of Anglophone tradition, it comes out of more of a documentary tradition, whereas the Francophone, as I was talking about, has a kind of more Francophone aesthetic. But yeah, and I think the key point about Sudan being, it's independent in 1956, but it's sort of a Egyptian British kind of confabulation, a condominium, exactly, specifically a kind of shared sovereignty. But those movements are very real. So I think both the category of African cinema as well as these national categories often do more harm than good, and they're kind of ways of holding these, image making things in place rather than helping them circulate and helping us understand them. And when the question becomes, do the filmmakers want their films to be understood as cinema, or do they want to be understood in more specific?
That's a great question. And I see Buki has her hand raised, and I want to encourage anybody, you can also put a question in the chat if you prefer, but we can open it up, I think, now for some questions. Go ahead, Buki.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
So my question actually follows up on what Professor Shipley just said about whether those categories of whether it's African cinema or like those national categories do more harm than good. My question is the flip. Do we lose something if we want, and I tie this to some of the stuff that I learned about in Professor Coly's classes about African literature, right? Do we lose something if we then actively decide not to call something African cinema or actively decide not to call something African literature? Do we sacrifice an identity building component, a community building a component in the name of, say, greater access to distribution or even greater incentive for the filmmakers? Like, what are we sacrificing if we open that up, and what are we gaining if we do? And I aimed this at Professor Shipley, but anyone can sort of jump in.
I'll just very briefly, and then to get back to one of the questions about the politics of art, one of the questions become how, I mean, your question is crucial because in a lot of the contexts that we're looking at, people saw arts as crucial to independence movements, to building up national culture, to fight against colonial powers, and to produce new forms of consciousness, very much in a kind of Fanonian tradition or other versions of that, sort of Pan-African traditions. It's a crucial question. And a lot of filmmakers these days are not necessarily thinking about that. Some are, but one of the things that I see also is commercial organizations use things like Pan-African language and language of political solidarity as a way to market stuff. So then the question about the appropriation of various forms of themselves always being enfolded back into capital. But do people think that cinema can and should be revolutionary and radical? And if so, how? I don't know, Junaid, what do you think? Do you see cinema, do you see filmmaking, do you see image making as revolutionary from where you're working?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I think, well, if a person is to take a camera and try to tell give an honest account of what is going on around them, it probably would end up being kind of revolutionary and political, you know? But I do think sometimes for commercial considerations, though, people do tend to either choose to leave certain things out or present like images that don't quite tell the full story, whether because like they fear the repercussions or they want to attract the widest possible audience. I mean, a thing that I have discussed a lot with some of my collaborators out here has been, okay, what kind of stories do we tell, and where what inspires us taking the initiative to tell those stories. Like sometimes it's more like, well, let's think about what audiences have liked in the past, and then construct our story based on that, right? But I think I usually like to push back and be like, well, how about we think about, well, like, how do we feel? Where are we at? What's going on around us? And how can we like try to say something that's reflective about that, you know? Because I remember also talking about something we learned from Professor Coly's class. I think we read this paper in which the writer was talking about how like art or literature is like a mirror that is held up to society, you know, so that we can see who we are in the arts that is created about us, you know. So I think it can be revolutionary if it comes from a certain place, but it's not always the case, you know. Yeah. But also about the thing of whether or not we lose something when we categorize like everything as, okay, this is African cinema. I do think it depends, right? I think we can have a category of African cinema while also acknowledging that there's a vast diversity within that umbrella term, you know? I remember one time I had just seen this movie, I think it's a Senegalese movie, Tukibuki, which actually Eyimofe reminded me somewhat about that film, because in Tukibuki as well, the two main characters are like have dreams of leaving their country to go to Europe, you know? And I remember reading online about Tukibuki, and on all these listings, everyone's like, Tukibuki is the greatest African movie of all time, you know? And I was like, well, it's a good movie, you know, but perhaps, like, I wonder if the publications that made that listing had actually seen a lot of African movies to make that claim, you know? So, I mean, I think now, like, everyone's like, okay, of course, Tukibuki is the best African movie of all time, which perhaps it does deserve that title. But I think there's a lot more out there that's perhaps we aren't seeing, you know? Yeah.
But I think these publications and then girl are also the same publication. I suspect these are international publication, maybe, you know, European journals, European festivals, right? And so we need to bear in mind the role of this institution, right? In producing and sustaining a certain idea of Africa and producing a certain category of, you know, of African cinema, right? Where Ousmane Sembène is officially known as the father of African cinema, right? And so this basically matters, and also on the way filmmakers think about cinema, think about how to gain access to the international circuit that make them legible as, you know, as African filmmakers.
Garrett, do you want to jump in? Oh.
I mean, basically, it's sort of more of a comment than a question, but immediately follow up to what Junaid and Ayo just said. When we watched these films as the selection committee, you know, that dates back to the winter, I think many of us were struck by how resonant both films were. But of course, that also then raised for me the question, why is it resonant? I mean, on the one hand, I don't know that many films from Nigeria and from Sudan, none. But on the other hand, it's a film that's, you know, that resonated, and where I recognized certain patterns of storytelling, certain cinematographic techniques that one is familiar with, but I obviously cannot classify, you know, if they have a national imprint or not. But and I forgot who produced these films and to what degree these films are already targeted towards an international audience so that they make their money back. But it's not really a question, but it's this play between reaching an audience that sort of has seen a lot of films, but maybe not films from that region, and you know, attaching to a sort of an aesthetic of international art cinema, which both of these films in different ways do very, very successfully, but at the same time foregoing perhaps greater appeal to a national audience, which is something we talked about earlier in the conversation.
And I would just like to tag on or turn Garrett's observation into a question a bit for all three of you, which is that I was fascinated that the Asiri brothers, who co-directed Eyimofe as their first feature, one of them went to NYU Film School and the other went to Columbia Film School. So, you know, part of it is I wonder about, you know, the intention as far as audience or strategy to finance or distribute, but also I just wonder about the many streams of cultural and aesthetic influence. And Abu Alala also references Kiarostami in his credentials, you know, and I think putting that in his bio, it's sort of claiming a certain kind of lineage that also has a very deep and different cinematic tradition, but all these currents start to, you know, influence each other. So I'm curious to delve a little bit more into, you know, the post-colonial context of creating art when your film education itself is international, you know, from the early stages of an artist's trajectory.
Can I quickly say that, I mean, this is not new really in African cinema, right? Because even the first generations of African filmmaking, Francophone Africa, were almost all trained in the Soviet Union, interestingly enough, because there used to be a time before that when you had a French official decree whereby Africans from the colonies, right, could not gain access to film school. I mean, they could study anything they wanted in France, but not cinema. And so what happened, a lot of that first generation of filmmakers, be it Semben and then, Sisakos and so forth, studied in the Soviet Union. And also this then had also an effect, an impact on their cinematographic language and the aesthetic of early African cinema.
Wow. So my question, what I'm curious about, because I do understand that, yes, a lot of the cinema that emerges from Africa that gets international renown is usually made by creators who probably got their education outside the continent, probably even raised the resources to produce those films from like outside the continent as well, And then when these movies get made and are released, the local audiences aren't able to connect with them as much as the international audience. But I do wonder about the older generation, like Semben's generation. I wonder if audiences in Senegal connected with his movies as much as I think international audiences did.
International audiences connected more with Semben's movies than Senegalese audience, right? So even in the context of Senegal, Semben's audience tended much more to be a very elite, upper class, bourgeois audience, much more so than a more generalized, audience. And it changed actually. If you looked at Semben's evolution, his latest film started to cater more towards local sensibilities, the sensibilities of local audiences, as opposed to his earliest film, right? So they had almost like a Nollywood, a Nollywood feel. So there is a way in which Francophone African filmmakers later started borrowing some of the strategies from Nollywood, because Nollywood does have an audience, a local audience in Africa, but interestingly has also been able to cultivate a transnational African diasporic audience. Nollywood is very popular in Haiti and in places like Jamaica, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's that model, to get back also to Junaid's point about making films really quick. There's something about the Nollywood model that's not just about making one good film, but it's rather about thinking about cultivating cinema, and not necessarily using the term cinema, but making a lot of films really fast that are going to be exciting, that kind of captivate audiences, that create characters that are melodramatic and large, and there's always going to be more. So if you don't like this one, there's going to be 10 more behind it. And it's just been the energy, you can just feel it. And I remember once in the 90s when I was working with filmmakers in Ghana and Nigeria, and actors started to move back and forth, you start to get people talking about like national style and stuff. So Nigerian actors would come to Ghana, and Ghanaian directors would be annoyed because the Nigerian actors from a Ghanaian perspective were always overacting. So the Ghanaian directors would be like, stop shouting. And the Nigerian actors were like, no, you guys are too quiet. Like no one cares about if you're just going to sit there quietly and you're too slow. And Ghanaian editors literally would say, no, we want to slow down the pace because we want to reflect, we want to hold a mirror up to daily life, and life is slow, so we want the film to be slow. And Nigerians were like, no, cut that. It's too slow. We got to move faster. Everything's got to be high level, high energy. But then you see early Nigerian cinema, sometimes like there'd be a scene, some of it would be scripted, but then they would go off script and be improvising. And the scene would just go on and on and on. It wouldn't be like, all right, 1, 2 lines, cut, next scene. It would be like, all right, let's play it out like you might a real dialogue. And then they started to edit more quickly to kind of keep the audience. So it's interesting to see it evolving. And again, it's thinking about audience in really kind of complicated ways, not just like, oh, let me make one perfect art piece, but all right, let's throw some stuff out there, do something with energy,
Yeah, and I do think there's lots about the circumstances out here that make it such that to create a movie in the sort of like formal way, as you would learn in film school, in some of these parts, like you can only do that if you have considerable resources behind you. But so usually, like sometimes you have to like be quick on your feet, you know, like be able to like have like quick setups and then move on to the next one, right? Because you don't have all the resources in order to like take your time and do it well. So for that reason, I think our audiences have also to some extent acquired a taste for that maybe. So to some extent, you know, like when like certain movies are presented, like also I do think what I think is, and this is me saying it based on like my experiences watching movies with friends. Like I think Ghanaian audiences are willing to accept certain cinematic conventions from an American movie because you're like, okay, it comes with these sort of expectations, right? Then say if those same conventions came in a Ghanaian movie, I feel, you know, they'll be like, okay, it's so slow, like, you know, that kind of thing, you know? And so I wonder if like we're in that trap of like, okay, audiences expect this. So in order to have a profitable movie, you have to make a movie that satisfies those tastes. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to jump in for a moment and just remind the audience, we'd love to have your comments or questions.
Yes.
And I also wanted to just try throwing something a little different in here. And this is a question for the whole audience as well as our speakers. But I just wanted to ask if anybody found themselves very taken in and just having it, you know, going on the emotional journey and forgetting all the scholarship and all the context and just having an experience of the film. And if so, if there might be any scenes or moments or characters or shots or music or anything that just really connected with your heart center. As a filmmaker, that's always my measure of success. I would love it if scholars also would talk about all the important things around it. But if I haven't reached the heart, then I've failed. So I'm curious whether anybody had moments like that with these films. And feel free to just unmute and share if anybody would like in the audience or reflect.
When I talk about space, for me it was, space, right? So the way the camera, you know, brings in space, and at some point it looks like it really merges with the character, right? And it happens both in the Sudanese film with, you know, the wide shots, you know, of the desert, but also in the Nigerian film, the way he brings in the city, right? And the chaos of the city, right? And the beaten down, you know, city, right? It looks like even, I found myself thinking about, I think in bricolage, I think you say bricolage also, right? I'm thinking in French now, right? Thinking about, you know, bricolage. And there was a connection here again for me with the generator. I'm really fascinated by the generator. It's like, I think I'm going to watch, to write a paper about the use of the generator and how it also resonates with what it means. I mean, the environment of African cinema, of Nollywood, of making do with whatever is at hand with limited resources, right? And you produce something, right? And so there is something, I'm still trying to connect the dots in there. So I was taken by that and I was moved by that.
I don't know if anyone in the audience has anything to say, but I really connected with You Will Die at 20 a lot. I mean, like, so I grew up in Tamale, Ghana, like Muslim upbringing. So like I could connect a lot with the Arabic school, like aspects of it. I attended Arabic school myself, you know. I was familiar with some of the surahs that were being recited in there. Also like just like there's this one shot in the movie, I don't know, like the transition that to show him growing up, you know, like after he's put in the box, you know, it's like the camera is on what's his name? Muzammil, then it pans, it's sort of like tracks to the right, revealing his mom, then tracks even more so to the right to reveal him as in his late teens, right? I think at 19 years old, you know, and holds on that, you know, and I found that very striking, you know. Also, all the scenes with his love interest, Naima, like I think those were really, really touching. And also like you could connect with it and also feel his pain when it doesn't quite work out with her, you know? And all the scenes with Suleiman, his mentor, the man who's telling him, go have some sense in your life, you know? Yeah. I really connected with that movie. I think it's beautiful. Yeah.
But very sad and very depressing.
Very sad, you know? But also I think the ending is kind of hopeful, right? Because he eventually breaks out of the trap and to some extent is hopefully running to his liberation, I hope, you know? Yeah.
Professor Shipley, did you have a heart-string moment in either of these films? And then we also do have a very interesting question in the chat.
Yeah, just real quick. I mean, I agree with Junaid. I connected with that character. There's a couple things that I think that the actors were brilliant, and the cinematographer like was very patient. So the couple scenes that I really was struck by was when they kissed on the rock, when the girl says to the boy, she's like, well, I hope that if I say I kiss a boy and then he says, I love you back, but the camera's behind them and she turns, so you see her in profile, and then she crosses. And so you see him from behind in profile, then turn and sort of say, I love you. And you don't know if she hears or not, but it's just beautifully shot. It's very intimate. And then the other scene that particularly struck me was when the father shows up and the scene with you don't know. I mean, I was just thinking about, I would love to shoot that scene, or I was thinking about more as a theater director. The wife is there and the husband shows up and you're like, okay, go. And how are they going to play that out? I wondered how many takes they did. I mean, the tension was beautifully done, and her choice as an actor was just amazing. Yeah. I got the impression that was her doing that. I don't know, I would love to know more about that scene and how they shot it and things like that. But those two scenes moved me.
Yeah. And like the character of the mother, Sakina, she was such an image of strength and also stubbornness and I can't put words, but she was very, very striking as a character, and I really appreciated. I think a lot of the characters in the movie were just really well rendered, in my opinion. Yeah.
Much more in the Sudanese film though than in the
I'm talking about in the
Nigerian film.
Yes. Yeah.
So I'm wondering if Sandil, if you'd like to read your question, or I can read it for you.
Sandile.
I'm happy to read it. It sounds like, okay. I would like to revisit the language piece brought up by Professor Shipley earlier. Is it fair to say that consumers are becoming more comfortable with the use of subtitles? If so, does this present an opportunity for filmmakers to bring their work to international audiences in their local languages? Great question.
I mean, it's a multiple question. I mean, just a filmmaker aspect of it. I just remember again in the 80s and 90s when Ghanaian and Nigerian filmmakers were starting to make stuff, audiences were literally saying, I feel this because it's in Tree or it's in Yoruba. I don't feel something if it's not in my language that's not my heart language. It's sort of like you're saying, Samantha, it's like language is crucial to how you emotionally relate to something or how characters are built. So that's certainly, and I think, I don't know, do people think subtitle? I think it is a weird moment where subtitles maybe are more open.
Yeah. So I have thought a lot about this actually, as a filmmaker and making my movies and trying to determine whether or not to have the movies be in my local language or be in English, right? And that's been a very interesting question to think about. But I often think sometimes it also depends on maybe the body of work that the creator is coming with, or the reputation that you're coming with. I think audiences are willing to be okay, it's in a language I don't understand, but I've heard about this creator's work, so I am willing to read subtitles. Because I do know within Ghana, the thriving local language movie industry is in Tree, and that's because Tree is spoken everywhere, right? Even with music, it's hard for music in local languages other than Tree to have national recognition, right? So you have the Dagbani film industry, which is where I am from, which is thriving locally, but nationally no, you have local movie industries from various other parts of the country that are struggling to stand on their feet, right? But with the Tree movie industry, yes, that has a certain national presence. And I do feel with that national presence, if a filmmaker were to now make a really good film and be I'm trying to put this out to the rest of the world, because of the presence of Twi speakers in the diaspora, I think it could move far, you know. But I think there's a lot of considerations to be made, you know. I think perhaps the way I'll go about it is perhaps, hopefully, get an audience, a local audience with perhaps English movies. There may be experiments to see if they would accept a local language movie from me, you know. I think that's how I would go about it. Yeah.
Professor Coly, did you have anything you wanted to say on the language side? Otherwise, it looks like we have another question from Buki. And I thought we'd go till 9:15 if everybody has that time. And we're running a little bit over, but it's such a rich conversation. But
no, I agree with Junaid. I think he said it all.
Okay, great. Buki, would you like to unmute?
Yeah, it's not a question. I was just going to the subtitles thing. I feel like the thought that I always have is like, what comes first, right? Because Bong Joon-ho talked about this when he won the Oscars. Like, if people just get over their fear of subtitles, they'll be introduced to so many, like such a wide variety of amazing movies. And it started that whole conversation about like international acclaim for English as a first language speaking filmmakers. And I wonder what comes first. Does the notoriety of the filmmaker then allow people to be more receptive to non-English films? Or I don't know, it's just an interesting thing to think about, how some filmmakers are now, it seems like they've transcended that barrier. People are much more receptive to their films. And I don't know that that's permeated the African context quite yet. But it's just a thought.
The other thing is voiceover or whatever. So one of the things that actually one of the ways in which I learned Twi was watching, like they would dub Mexican and Latin American soap operas and Indian soap operas in Twi. So they would have voice actors, like, because a lot of people don't read English. So they would dub it in Twi. So it was a great way for me to try and learn Twi, because it was like, you can tell what's going on in a Mexican soap opera anyway. So, so dubbing is also a really interesting set of choices. And you got to think about it from the actor's perspective. If it's not a language that you think in, it's hard to give a good performance. So I think it's like the actors should be considered as well. Like you want the actors to really portray something that's powerful for them, that they feel. And then go with it. And most people are watching on this thing anyway. They're not watching on. So, they read it or they hear it or whatever. Be like playful with it. There's a question about Netflix.
I guess it depends, because I mean, growing up, we watched a lot of Bollywood movies and they were mostly subtitled. Or sometimes there are no subtitles, but I'll still watch them anyway. I guess perhaps if there's something interesting going on the screen, people would pay attention.
Yeah, I mean, and that also speaks to a narrative. Like if the narrative is powerful and there's music and the characters are moving, the story's moving, you get some of it, maybe you don't. I also knew some older West Africans who kind of learned Hindi a little bit from watching Bollywood, because they were like, all right, I watched so many of these movies. Or I know Nigerians who they could speak Twi because they'd listened to so much high life music in Twi. It didn't matter. Like, so there's ways in. If there's some way in that you can have, like, then that's great. But there has, like, if it's all just like a dinner table drama and it's dialogue and you don't understand it, you're not going to watch. Like if it's drama, cool, boom, 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 things happening.
Looks like we have a discussion going on in the chat.
Yeah, what's up with that? Netflix, what's happening?
So Jordy, Jordan, I don't know if you want to ask your question, unmute. Oh, yeah, he's still there. I'll read it for him. I think the question, and it maybe is one to shoot towards you, Junaid, does, given the culture of the different traditions, does having a film or TV play on a massive platform like Netflix or Amazon, is that attractive to you as a filmmaker, or does it feel like it cheapens or compromises the work?
Okay, well, I think that depends on like maybe the specific deal, right? Because I mean, I think if like a person or like some producers spend like a lot of money producing a movie and Netflix maybe like underpays for it, then maybe that is cheapening it. And I don't really know what goes on behind the scenes. I've just only heard certain like rumors or whatever, but I do think these platforms have the potential to really help with the distribution problem. Because as I said, distribution has been a very big thing. You know, like we had DVD, straight to DVDs, but then piracy became a problem. So now producers find it hard to like make enough profit from the movies they make, right? So perhaps these platforms might be a solution to that. We'll have to wait and see, you know. Yeah. Yeah.
Another question just came in. I found the dilemma of believing your child would die at a certain time compelling. Are local myths a frequent tradition of storytelling in African film?
Yes.
Yeah, I would say so. Yes.
Yeah.
Like even
Present. I think
well,
they,
oh, sorry.
they are really, I mean, they thread through. If I was to think about what we understand as francophone, you know, as African cinema, I think the use of local myth, and especially when I think of many of the African film that became successful on the international circuit and got prizes actually, right? So the use and adaptation of recycling, if you want, of local myth was definitely a factor. So this is a distinctive feature, I would say, of African cinema. And I think we find it also in Nollywood, right? Nollywood local indigenous African myth from specific places.
That is true. Well, so in Ghana, I know the cinematic industries that do tap into local myths tend to be the local language industries, you know. So I know like here in Tamale, we have various filmmakers that will tap into like old mythological stories about some old chief or something and try to create a movie based around that, you know. Or even in Kumerwood, I know there's some stories that have to do with some of those myths. But with what we call Gallywood, which tends to be the English language industry in Accra, the focus is not so much on those myths, like for the most part. Although every now and then you find one or two movies that would veer towards that, but it's not usually the norm. Yeah.
It looks like Sylvia and Garrett have another question.
Thank you. Yeah, since we're on the topic of Amazon or Netflix, and probably specifically to Jesse, because Jesse, you were the first to bring up this in this current collaboration between Netflix and Nigerian cinema. Job was very successful with her Netflix Antique that was up for an award, but I'm imagining the kind of collaboration you were talking about is much more geared towards Netflix breaking into a local market rather than sort of bringing Netflix to English language audiences. And I'm wondering how, if you could say more, just how we are to envision that collaboration and what's at stake for the Nigerian industry, because Nollywood is on its own terms already pretty successful commercially and sort of, you know, doesn't necessarily need Netflix. So I'm wondering, how do you see that going?
Yeah, I mean, part of what is done successfully is they ramped up capital in certain ways because they're tied into sort of cable television. And they also, the people who own the cinemas across Nigeria are also tied into the productions. So in a way that happened in the US, the people distributing. So once you produce a film, you automatically have cinemas across Nigeria putting those films out in the same way that happened at a particular moment in Hollywood. So that's one of the things that they did. The question, as Junaid brought up, is one of piracy. So they also realized, all right, we got to get things out fast and in some ways pirate our own things. So they would put out VCD discs, or they would sometimes pay pirates to do it. Say like, all right, you're going to take some of it. So it sort of became a sort of non-formal thing. So what Netflix and Amazon are trying to do. So Netflix would buy some films. So like, I know that they bought Green, White, Green, and they bought Taxi Driver for not very much money, but better than nothing. But there's some things they're buying outright. But what they're trying to do now is be a little bit more production houses. So they're trying to make their own films.
You know, I had like, my intention for closing was to invite you both, well, all three of you, if Junaid made it back in, to just share with us a question or several that you would encourage us to ask ourselves when we're encountering a film, maybe in another language from a part of the world that we're not familiar with. But I just thought, you know, how do we become better viewers of these films? Are there questions we can ask ourselves that can lead us into a deeper inquiry? Bring with us. I was curious to know if you had any thoughts on that.
I mean, it's a profound question. It's a seemingly simple question that really gets to the core of questions about, you know, particularity, you know, aesthetics, history, context, all of those kinds of things. I mean, on the one hand, I would say two contradictory things. One is watch everything the same and watch it from a place of viewing with open questions without having expectations. Don't have expectations of something because it has a historical legacy. I mean, same you'd watch anything and try and get as much context as possible, you know. But I'm always interested in how aesthetic choices are informed by particular traditions of performance or use of the camera, things like that, and how you innovate within particular linguistic traditions as well. I don't know, Ayo, what do you think?
And I'm always, I mean, interesting, and this is something that I think often with my students, is about how and where, when you came into contact, right, with that, you know, that product, right, from a foreign culture, right? Did it come as part of a category, right? And so, you know, the work that you need to do to deconstruct the category and to understand how that category came into being, right? Because of course, I mean, especially with African cinema, and Jesse and I have been talking about, but there is always a tendency to exoticize, right, African cinema. And very often, sometimes, I think African audiences or even African scholars have learned to be very suspicious of African films, but also even African literary texts, right, that are successful abroad, right, that are made it abroad and that come to become proxy, let's say, for African literature and for African cinema. So this would be my note of, you know, my note of caution.
Well, the thing I was going to say before also is, you know, my favorite, I think one of the most brilliant filmmakers in the world today is John Akomfra, whose parents are Ghanaian. He grew up, you know, lived in UK most of his life. People don't know his films in Ghana.
Yeah.
Can you repeat his name, please?
John Akomfra, AKROM.
Okay.
I'll write it down in here. I can't spell out loud. I always can't spell.
All
out
right,
loud.
yeah.
But John, is he a Ghanaian filmmaker? Is he an African filmmaker? He's been UK based.
Mm-hmm.
Is he a London filmmaker? I mean, he's the most brilliant, but his, you know, set of references are capacious and complicated. And his parents were involved in the independence movement, and he left when Nkrumah was overthrown in '66 as a young kid. But they don't, you know, his films are not distributed very widely at all. So I would just question the categories. But as I think both Junaid and Boogie pointed out, don't assume what they do or what they don't do. You know, national categories, linguistic categories, and Pan-African categories have particular histories, some of which are about resistance and powerful political opposition, and some of which are about commercialization, and some of which are exoticizing violence. So you have to kind of be complicated in the way you view things.
I didn't want to let the night close also without asking Professor Coly about the body and gender. Just given I haven't had the opportunity to read your work, but I just felt like both of these films around sexuality, and particularly women's sexuality, I just was curious if you might share some observations with us. If that's such a huge topic, I'm sorry, like to drop this, like your whole.
And I was not particularly attentive to that, because as I said, actually, when I was watching them, I was really more thinking of them within the category of African cinema and thinking about cinematographic language, thinking about aesthetics. Is the in the first film, in the Nigerian film, right? You know, there are questions around gender, sexuality, the vulnerability in this case, right, of the female body and the female, I mean, her ability to use the female body, if you want, as a resource, right, as a tool to survive, but it was also her tool to try to get out, right? And that tool also becomes her own trap because, and I'm not sure if I'm making sense here, right? But I'm thinking about how the body becomes both a site of possible liberation and escape, but at the same time, become a site of oppression and a site of entrapment. Right, and we see it also even with the case of her, is it her little sister, who's pregnant, who's pregnant, I believe, and all the complications she has to go through because of her, pregnancy. Although I have to say that I felt that that part of the film, it just did not work, I mean, for me, the two stories, the pairing of the two stories, and I understand what he was trying to do with, the push factors behind both. But I felt that the part about, the young woman and her sister just did not work well for me. It was not well executed. And then in the Sudanese film, I'm trying to think how the body is centered. Oh yeah, that's right, yeah. Of course, we have the girlfriend, the partner of the, the artist, right? Who's very liberated, right? Who can fully express, I think, her sexuality, right? In a society, in a very Islamic society, but then you have, if you want, this space of female sexual agency and sexual, autonomy, which I think actually the film did a good job of, of showing. But I'll have to think about it more to be able to give a more coherent response.
I really appreciate those comments, especially for such a huge topic. Pardon my dogs that were going, that's in the back. I would hang on for a long while. I know it's extremely late in Ghana.
Yeah, I'm okay.
and everybody probably needs to go move on with other things. But if any of the other guests had final remarks, or any of our guests, our panelists, if you had final remarks you wanted to share, if not, we can just. Mbuki, this was really wonderful. Thank you so much, RIF Samantha, talented panel, Professor Shipley, Colleague Junaid. I miss you all, and audience.
Thank you, Buki. Thank you so much. Junaid, nice to see you.
So nice to see you, Professor Coly. And nice to see Professor Shipley as well. We met when you brought Daniel Oriahi to campus. Yes, yeah. But yeah, like this was such a beautiful, like the movies were beautiful, and I'm like glad we had this conversation. Hopefully I get to, I will watch them again, but hopefully I get to share them with some of my friends out here and hear what their thoughts are about them. Yeah.
And we'll be back in Ghana. Dartmouth has a study abroad program in Ghana.
Really? I actually met you for the first time in Accra when you were here with, I think you were here in 2015 fall. That's when I met you for the first time.
And then in 2000, I think 19, we went back, and we are we'll go back in 2022. I believe we are back in Ghana, so I'll be in touch.
Oh, so I'll be in Ghana. Hopefully I can connect with you while you're here. But before then, it's nice that we're reconnected through email. I would try to keep up correspondence.
Please do.
Yes.
And may I make a plea to everybody who's still here to, when you hear about interesting films, if they're shorts, if they're retrospectives, if they're new things coming out, if you're not sure if the aesthetics would resonate, send them our way. We really want to continue to bring really interesting work here to RIF, and your work particularly as well. So thank you. Craig, did you want to say anything?
No, I just wanted to thank everybody so much. This was such an engaging, such an interesting conversation. I thought it might be good, but I didn't expect it to be just interesting every second. Thank you, Junaid. So great to meet you.
Nice to meet you,
Ayo,
Craig.
so great to meet you, and I look forward to seeing you all again sometime soon.
Thank you so much, guys. This has been really fun. Thank you for hosting this and bringing us all together.
Thank you,
Really
Johanna. Nice to see you today.
Thank you. Have a good night, everybody.
Bye-bye. Bye, Joanna.